Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with William Van Hippel, who is a retired professor of psychology from the University of Queensland, and also the author of a couple books. The most recent one is called The Social Paradox, When Finding What You Want Means Losing What You Need, which is, I think of it as a sequel or outgrowth to this book, which came out a couple of years ago, called The Social Leap, the New Evolutionary Science of Who We Are, Where We Come From, and What Makes Us Happy. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
So, yeah, I know you were teaching psychology, and yet these books, they're covering a lot of different disciplines, right? I mean, my perfect guest, right? Very interdisciplinary. And I think you might characterize them maybe not as evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology, but in some way evolutionary ethics. And I mean that in the original meaning of the word, where ethics is about, how to live, right? And so part of it is describing the world, and part of it is also kind of offering some guidance to people in this world as to how one might live if one's interested in living a happier and more fulfilled life. And so I guess the question is, why should we be looking to evolution for guidance on issues like this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I like that label as well. I love the idea of being a scientist of ethics. I think the answer about why we should look to evolution is that we've got these evolved tendencies or proclivities, and they're far from genetic determinism. We can do what we want. You can take your strongest genetic push, like the desire to have sex, for example, and you can say no and never do it your whole life. So we know that we have control over these things. But when you choose the path that your genes want you to go in, it's kind of the path of least resistance. And so sometimes that's a bad idea because it's to murder and pillage and do all sorts of bad things. That's the dark side of human nature. But sometimes that's actually a helpful way to think about the route to happiness. What is it? How did my ancestors live? What did they do that made them a success, both reproductively and survival-wise? And then how might I harness those kinds of things to help myself be happy in the world that we now occupy, which often is not a good match to our ancestors, but of course sometimes still is.
Yeah, I was talking to somebody recently on a podcast, and he said that, we evolved to do this particular behavior he was referring to because it makes us feel good. And therefore, it makes us happy. And I thought, well, hold on a second. That kind of begs the question somewhat, right? Because, evolution doesn't care about our happiness, right?
At all, except as a tool.
Yeah, it's just a motivational tool, right? And it's often happiness that, it's not happiness that it's interested in. It's more interested in, like, maybe you're motivated more by, like, the immediate pleasure of whatever you're engaging in. And happiness might be a lucky byproduct.
That's right. And so Trivers, for example, who I've done a lot of work with, talks about what he calls phenotypic indulgences, which are things that make you happy that are kind of short-circuiting what evolution actually was trying to get you to do. Now, of course, evolution is not trying to get you to do anything, but what evolution is doing is those people who did things that were in their genes' best interest because they enjoyed them and therefore are likely to repeat that behavior are the ones who are more likely to survive and more likely to have offspring. So our ancestors who loved to eat feces aren't our ancestors because that wasn't a good survival strategy. And so people who love the taste of feces have been weeded out of the human chain, but not the dung beetle chain and not the, a variety of other animals that can make a living that way because they can resist the pathogens better than we can. And so for me, I think happiness is evolution's one of its best tools. It motivates us to do things that are in our genes' best interest, not necessarily ours as human beings who may or may not want to do those things, but it motivates us to do what's in our genes' best interest typically by making us happy when we do those things.
But is it happiness that motivates us, or is it more like the prospect of happiness? Because it seems like really bad, hedonic forecasters were consistently bad, right?
Yeah, well, the thing is, we are consistently bad. There's an impact bias, and there's a couple of other biases, but we rarely say, oh, if I go there, it'll make me happy and it makes me sad. And rarely do we say, if that happens, I'll be sad and it makes us happy. So we usually get the direction right. We just don't get the duration and the impact right. And there's possible evolutionary reasons for that as well. But setting that aside, you're absolutely right. Happiness is one of many. The desire for happiness is one of many motives that drive us. The fear is a big driver. Every emotion we have, shame, guilt, the whole 9 yards, they all are there because evolution was able to shape our behavior with those emotions to make us more effective in our past.
Mm-hmm. Well, look, the most recent book, The Social Paradox, I mean, I think of this as kind of like it's a grand history, right? It's a grand historical narrative. And of course, as with any grand historical narrative, you've got to simplify things. You got to have like a nice simplistic framework. And your framework basically has these two characters, right? It has these two forces, right? That of connection and that of autonomy. And, we have a desire for both of these things. Oftentimes I teach a course on the workplace. And one of the things that consistently seems to lead to a workplace where people are happy and they want to work there is that the workplace seems to offer both of these things, and yet there are trade-offs, right? If I were to think of it as a frontier, right? If we're on the frontier, the only way to get more autonomy is to kind of give up some connection, right? So are you viewing? Do you think of these things as substitutes or as complements?
I think they're more complements. That it's the rare human who only wants one or only wants the other, or who has the misfortune of only having one or the other. It happens, but it's rare. And there's the super rare human who has loads of both, where either they're the king of their world, or their friends and their romantic partners and everybody else is a perfect complement to them. They all love to do the same things at the same time. But those are rare. And mostly what happens is that when we enter relationships, which are super important to us and our happiness, we're a gregarious species. When we enter those relationships, we have to sacrifice some degree of autonomy to do what our friends want some of the time, or at least at the time they want, etc. And when we decide to pursue our autonomy, usually in pursuit of skills and self-development, we have to sacrifice our relationships to some degree, because that means we're spending time honing our own skills and not socializing or helping others.
But I mean, do you think of this narrative as one of I don't know, the fall of man, right? Where, we had this balance right at some point, and now we have kind of, got the balance wrong, or is it that maybe in the past, we didn't have enough autonomy, and now we don't have enough connection?
I think that it's a blend of both. That I think in the past, we were overly connected, largely because we had absolutely no choice. In order to survive in that environment, we had to cooperate all the time. We had to stick together with our other members of our group because we would be eaten if we went off alone. The list is long. And so we probably could have used a bit more autonomy. And I say that based on anthropological evidence where, for example, there's this lovely story with this hunter-gatherer, and I can't remember what group it is anymore, where some tourist had given him a sweater. And he's chatting with the anthropologist, and she said, well, what are you going to do with that sweater? And he goes, I'm keeping it. I'm tired of sharing everything I own. And that just must have been an onerous burden, right, to share everything you own. And I've seen that time and again in different contexts where the rules simply mandate you have to do it. You've really got no choice, but it can grate on you over time. So I suspect they were a little bit too connected and not quite enough autonomy. The problem is that they were probably 60-40, 50-50 is perfect, and we're 80-20. And so I think we'd be better off being where they are than where we are today, at least as far as our happiness is concerned.
Yeah, I mean, in a perfect world, right, we would presumably be able to kind of adjust the dial and decide, where we want to be on that frontier in terms of connectivity and autonomy. And we would know kind of where we wanted to be. But it seems like we don't really have either one. Like, first of all, we don't really have that much choice, in today's world. We're kind of forced into a world of autonomy. And even if we had the choice, and there are places where we do have the choice, it seems like we maybe don't really know that we should be pursuing more connectivity, and we wind up choosing the autonomy because somehow we've been, I don't know, brainwashed into thinking that that's what we should pursue.
Well, I think that it's not so much brainwashed, although you raise a good point. There's some of that going on. But I suspect the bigger effect of why we keep pursuing autonomy is that in our ancestral environment, because it was so rare, we evolved to grab it when we could.
So it's like a mismatch theory, like we just sugar and stuff.
Yeah, just like we evolved to grab fat, salt, and sugar whenever we could, even if we weren't hungry, there's not enough of it to go around. So better stuff your face now, and then you'll be set when tomorrow rolls around and there isn't any. And now it's in the pantry all the time. And so it's bad for us. I think we're over-seeking autonomy in much the same way. But do we know what we want? Yeah. And there, we're terrible at introspection. And Danny Kahneman has great evidence for part of the reason why, which is our retrospective lives are not the same as our lived experiences. And so we look back on things that we maybe didn't really enjoy and think, oh, that was so great. And we look back on things that we really loved and thought, that's trivial. And he's got this separation between your retrospective self and your experiencing self. And so one of the things that you can do if you're worried, gee, I don't know, do I have the balance right? Is they have a lot of apps now where it'll experience sample you. It'll randomly beep you and say, what are you doing? How much fun are you having? And how much are you enjoying yourself, whatever the goal is that you want to measure. And you can answer that question yourself. And you can say, oh, gee, whenever I'm with my friends, I'm really giving it a high score. And when I'm by myself doing the stuff I thought I wanted to do, I'm not so happy. Maybe I've got the balance wrong.
Yeah. So, I mean, part of it is that, the environments in which we live, they kind of just keep pushing us in the direction of autonomy. I was just having lunch with a colleague, and I was talking about how difficult it is to, get people to come to a dinner party in a place like Berkeley. Like everybody's so busy and, pursuing their individual goals or maybe the goals of their nuclear family that, you get like a 10% acceptance rate. Whereas if you go to I used to teach at University of Virginia, which is a much smaller community, and I would get like a 90% acceptance rate. And yet people, when they're given the choice, they typically will choose to live in that environment where, they don't have that connectivity.
Yeah, that's a great example. And I started my career at Ohio State University, and we got together all the time, all the academics who taught there. And then I went to, I would go visit departments, places like Berkeley or Harvard or whatever, and they didn't even know where each other lived. And so the thing is, I remember talking to a colleague at Ohio State and going, why are people just more friendly here? And he goes, look, nobody would be here but for each other. Whereas if you're at Berkeley or Harvard or somewhere else, there's so many other reasons to be there that you may or may not be tightly connected to each other, and you may or may not have time for it. And your point is also well taken, the smaller community in Charlottesville compared to the bigger community in Berkeley. And so the problem is, of course, that when I think back on how much I enjoyed Ohio State, I loved the intellectual environment, but the social environment was a huge part of what made the intellectual environment so interesting. We had this habit of the social area getting together over meals, having read one of our grants, and then just all wailing on the person who wrote the grant and trying to help them make it better, and just over drinks and having a good time. Things that don't typically exist in departments that are in bigger cities or in departments that are, renowned for other reasons.
Yeah, I mean, I remember I used to read these novels, academic novels, and I thought, oh, you go to Berkeley and we sit in the hot tub, with your colleagues, or whatever at the faculty club and so forth. And, that you just don't see that. I mean, you don't see it in academia. You don't see it at, law firms. You don't see it at investment banks. I mean, it seems like when you're among the most successful people, they have less community perhaps than even some of the, people who are less prosperous, right?
Well, that's right. And part of the reason, of course, is that what's made them prosperous is they're kind of autonomy machines. They're pursuing their work. They're hard at it in order to be so successful that they could be at a school like Berkeley. And then another part of the problem is that I think it's too easy to forget that really we evolved this need for autonomy in order to make ourselves more valuable to our group, to enhance our connections. But it can become a pursuit in its own right. And so, I love academics. I love the work I do, but I end up feeling super burned out if that's all I do, if I don't have the social side to my life as well. And you can see that in yourself, and it becomes more evident, at least to me, as I get older. I start to realize, I don't want to, and I don't need to burn the candle at both ends anymore. And so it makes sense to me that when you're young and pushing hard to develop your skills and to become the success, you should be so focused on work. But I think the problem is that we then forget that the whole point of that is to then, step back a little bit, continue to do the work, of course, but also use the success we've gained in order to enhance our connections.
Right. And I think you had some data in the first book about mobility and, how mobility can be bad for your health. I mean, just independent of other characteristics. If you're constantly, I don't know, decamping from, one city to another, particularly when you're young.
Yeah. Yeah, that's Shigo Oishi's data, and they're really cool data. And it's harder on introverts than it is on extroverts. So, if you keep moving into new communities, and if making friends for you is like something you got to push yourself to do rather than, oh boy, I get to go meet new people, then, you're building up this like allostatic overload repeatedly. You're over challenging your body with all these stress hormones, and there's cost you have to pay in the end for that. In this case, mortality was the dependent variable, that it kills you to move a whole bunch of times. And so disruption from your community is just not something that our ancestors did. Now, America is a wonderful place in so many ways. And part of what makes it so wonderful is that it's a highly mobile society. People go, oh, a better job on the other coast? I'm gone. I mean, look at you, Virginia to California, right? But Australia is not really that way. Like I remember one of my students wanted to do her PhD with me, and I said, well, we're in Sydney. I said, you're a much better fit for the gang up in Queensland. She goes, I'm not going 1,000 Ks away. Just like it was a foreign idea, whereas in America, you go, oh, off I go, right? And so that residential mobility has pluses as far as success is concerned, but it has some real minuses when it comes to connection.
Yeah, I mean, you look at people from, say, Argentina, right, who, they were born in Buenos Aires and they went to school in Buenos Aires and they went to college and, they spend their whole lives there. And the people that they had as friends when they were 5 or 6 years old, are still friends when they're adults. It's almost as if, they're in this huge city, but they're almost like, hunter-gatherers in terms of the way their social networks operate.
And our ancestors used to be that way not that long ago. And so if you look in the United States, back in the 70s, people were a lot less wealthy than they are now, and the technology wasn't as good. And so it was not as easy to entertain yourself by yourself. Now there's so many options. You don't ever need to talk to another human to have entertainment all day long. But in the 1970s, if you wanted entertainment, you typically got together with your neighbors. And so back in the 70s, about 30% of Americans got together with their neighbors at least twice a week. And only 20% of them basically never got together with their neighbors at all. And those numbers have completely flip-flopped. We don't even spend time with our neighbors anymore, much less, with our childhood friends if we've pulled up roots and left.
Now, to what extent are these different ways of interacting with other people kind of substitutes for one another, right? So in other words, if you have fewer friends, but you have sort of a tighter nuclear family, because I think, we've seen that the nuclear family has become much more important, but our kind of cousins have dropped away. And also, we might have better connections online, right? Where, we stay in touch with people that we didn't stay in touch with before, but we're not interacting with them face to face. I mean, is there a single metric that we can use for sociability that factors in these different types of sociability? In other words, are, 10 different people that we know weekly equal to, one person that we know strong? Like, do we have good ways of thinking about those trade-offs?
That's a great question. And I think the short answer is we don't really know. It's a nuanced question where we don't know how those trade-offs work. The longer answer is that we do know that it's important to have at least one, ideally a few friends who you can count on. Both they would come through for you in a crisis, and who if something goes bad, and I share my situation with them, they'll listen to me and they'll provide some kind of material or emotional support. And when people have that, if they don't have that at all, 10 or 100 isn't good enough. But if they have that, then how many others they need to have becomes a little bit less clear to us.
Right. So, I mean, if we think of the function of the, clan or the extended family as social support in the event of an adverse event, right? So, you break your leg, you need somebody to kind of feed you and take care of you when you are out of commission. If that role is being now played by the welfare state or by, an insurance company, then, you're good to go. But it seems like psychologically, we haven't quite made that adjustment. So you still feel like you are vulnerable to life's events if you don't have those close connections.
That's right. And in fact, that's exactly the process that our ancestors, we have lots of wonderful evidence that way back to Homo erectus, you could break your leg, lose your teeth, and live for years after that probably the members of your tribe are literally chewing the hard food for you and then giving it to you. So there's enormous amounts of social support that we needed. The human blender. And so there's enormous amounts of social support that we needed and that we got that our chimpanzee cousins don't get. They break their leg and it's like, see you later. And so that's psychologically super important to us. And you point out, it actually doesn't matter anymore. And so if we evolved in today's world, we'd be a lot more like snow leopards. We don't need each other. I get online, I order in my coffee, I break my leg, a doctor shows up, patches it and leaves. But we didn't evolve in a world where that's how our solutions were provided. And so even though we can materially do that, we actually suffer emotionally when that's the life we lead.
So if we think about, survival probabilities or reproductive success, maybe is there a wedge now between that and happiness, right? So in other words, you can, in the past, those things like social connection would have presumably helped you be more reproductively successful. And so they also kind of make you happier. But now, presumably, you could be reproductively successful, but unhappy. Is this also damaging to your health and reproductive success now?
Well, the things that made us happy as far as the social connections were also, as you say, the things that made us reproductively successful. And they, in some ways, they very much still are. So if I'm famous or rich, I'm high in status, and then I'm attractive to members of the opposite sex or whoever I prefer, and I'm attractive to people who I want to be in my coalition. I have the sort of social accolades that actually make me feel good. And I think that's actually the basis of the Easterlin paradox, this notion that as societies get wealthier, people don't get happier, but richer people are happier than poorer people. And so if you look 150 years ago, the richest man on earth was a Rothschild, and he went into the doctor because he had a boil on his back, and the doctor lanced it with a dirty lance because they didn't know about that you should clean the thing after the last patient, and he died from it. So he has health care that's the worst than you would get from the worst doctor in any industrialized country, and he's the richest person on earth. And if you look at the quality of his food and the variability of what he ate, any metric that you want, your average lower middle class American or European is living a better life than he did. But I promise you that guy was happier than your average lower middle class American or European because he was at the top of the heap at the time. And we care an enormous amount about status because that determines who gets the goods that their society provides and who doesn't.
So it seems like status is status orthogonal to these, right? Because, presumably if you're someone who pursues autonomy, this is something which will potentially lead to higher status, right? Because you're out there, trying to, make a fortune and stuff like that. But also, if you really want status, you have to be enmeshed in this kind of social network, right? You can't have high status on a desert island.
That's right. And so I use the term sad success stories to refer to people who pursue autonomy. They make it, they do great, but then they forget, now I need to use all that I've gained from this to re-enmesh because I've been setting humans aside for a long time in order to get where I am. I need to scale back. And the problem is lots of people do the right thing and they do scale back, but the problem is many don't. They get caught up in the race. And especially in today's world, it's really easy to do that because all you have to do is get online, your Instagram account or whatever, and now you're looking at somebody more successful than you are. It doesn't matter how good you are at almost anything, there's going to be people who are doing better. And if you're caught up in this status race, this social comparison race, you can forget, well, actually, I've achieved way more than I need to have the things that I want in life and to enjoy my connections. And you get caught looking to achieve more and more without ever stopping.
Well, you worked with Trivers, and so you're familiar with these different life strategies. There are strategies that are pushing you towards success, early in life and those late in life. Is there sort of, I don't know, heterogeneity here? Like, is it sort of a frequency dependent strategy, right? In a world where everybody is kind of pursuing connectedness, maybe the person who's pursuing autonomy might have an advantage and vice versa? Or
well, remember that the variable that we're looking at here is one that evolution, as you said earlier, doesn't care about. The variable we're looking at here, the outcome is happiness. And so evolution wants you to live a long time because it wants you to reproduce and have lots of offspring who you can provide for, and they too will become successes and have lots of offspring of their own. That's all that evolution cares about. Current reproduction is the currency of evolution. And so from that perspective, what I call a sad success story, let's just say for sake of argument, I don't know Elon Musk. I don't know if he's sad or happy, but let's just say for the moment that he's a sad guy because he keeps forming brief relationships. They don't work out. Evolution's like, are you nuts, Bill? That guy's a huge success. He's got like 14 kids or something like this. And not just 14 kids, but from different women. So he's got different genetic variability among his offspring. They're going to be robust to whatever comes next. And so the sad success story is not something that evolution cared about. And it was also something that didn't happen in our past because you couldn't be a success like that without being really interconnected into your community. And so my concern is that what happens is that we keep pursuing success and status, but at a cost to our life satisfaction because we can now do so in a world where that doesn't mandate connection. And in the past, that just wasn't possible. What made you a success was being tightly connected to your tribe.
Now, you talk about differences, right? And of course, there's individual differences, but there's some kind of group differences, one of which is gender, right? So, males tend to prefer autonomy perhaps a bit more than females, and females tend to prefer connectivity. I mean, this does seem to make sense. I was wondering if you could, dig into it a little bit. I think about Otzi, right? The guy who in the Alps got stabbed with the, arrow. And you're wondering, like, what's this guy doing? Like, why is he, wandering around the mountains? And so, I mean, is that like just exogamy, right? Where this guy's leaving his group and trying to go find another group to hang out with? I mean, what's going on?
Yeah, a case like that. So we don't know. He's well looked after in his prior life. If I remember right, he has prior injuries that have healed. That's hard to do on your own. The other possibility is that, and I have no idea if this system existed in that time and place, but we know, for example, in the Kalahari that the Bushmen have this system, I don't even know how to pronounce it, Hiksaro, where they have these mandated sharing relationships with people. And some of them are very close, but they always maintain some that are far away. And that way, if things go pear-shaped where they live, they know they've got someone who will look out for them wherever they go, because they can go quite far away. And it's a lot of effort to maintain those relationships. You have to visit them, you have to bring them gifts. And it's very possible he's simply doing something like that. He's on his way to visit his good buddy Bob, who lives in the next mountain over, and share some kind of gifts with him and share stories, and then eventually go home, and he had the bad luck of getting intercepted by people who were not friendly to him. We can only conjecture in cases like that. But if I had to guess, I'd say somebody who's that well looked after, who's that well prepared, probably is pretty interconnected and was not this kind of isolated nomad.
Or he could have been exiled. I mean, I remember reading about, like Ovid got exiled from Rome. And this was the worst thing that could happen to you back in the day. And I remember thinking, like, what's the big deal? Like, hey, if I got exiled to Paris, I mean, hey, you got museums, you got croissants. And so, this idea of social exclusion, I mean, this is about the worst thing that can happen to you, right?
Yeah, so it was a death sentence for our immediate return hunter-gatherers if they couldn't find someone else to accept them. Now, often their misdeeds would precede them and they couldn't find someone to accept them, and then it really was a death sentence. Often people in your own group got sick of you. You go to a group that's related enough that they'll take you in, but doesn't know so well how annoying you are, and you're okay. But you could do that a lot more easily now in modern cities in anonymity than you could do it then. So it's a lot harder to be the sociopathic exploiter back in the day than it is now. And of course, for all we know, that was his story. I suspect not. I suspect that we have lots of evidence of lots of travel. When we look at, for example, to go back to the Xara relationships, we can see these little ostrich shell beads that they made traveled hundreds and hundreds of miles across the Kalahari. And I suspect that no one's carrying them that entire distance, but they're being brought around and shared, and humans have these mobile trade networks that have existed for a very long time. So when we see people off on their own who look well provisioned and didn't die of starvation, I tend to think that they were doing okay. They're just taking a risk that didn't pan out.
Yeah, there's all these studies that show that social exclusion is very similar to pain in terms of its neurological manifestations. And so some people have speculated that the opioid epidemic was driven primarily by kind of a sense of social exclusion that people were experiencing here in the U.S. Um, and so, I mean, is there good, solid evidence on the extent to which people are either objectively or subjectively socially excluded? And, it also seems to explain to some degree why it is that people don't move, right? So you have all this opportunity in California, you can make $60 an hour as a, yard keeper, and all those folks in Ohio, they're like, they're not moving, right? And a lot of people don't understand that, but it seems like, particularly when you are in a very stressful situation, the idea of like removing yourself from the only community that is a very daunting prospect.
Yeah, that's right. And look, loneliness is really hard on your health. We know that it kills you at rates higher than cigarettes once you get older, and you're more vulnerable. And so the feeling of loneliness doesn't guarantee you don't have people around, but it does mean that you don't feel part of it. You feel somewhat excluded. And of course, feeling excluded should hurt, because our ancestors who couldn't see that they're about to be excluded are the ancestors who kept misbehaving and therefore got excluded. When you look at hunter-gatherer societies, they all follow the same pattern of exclusion, whereby before they actually give you the heave-ho, first they kind of tease you. And if you don't respond to this teasing, well, already you're a little bit too thick-skinned, because that's meant to bring you back in line. If teasing doesn't work, then they start acting like you're not even there. They talk around you and not responding to you. Almost everybody, when they get to that point, starts to feel terrible. It feels like physical pain, because our ancestors, our potential ancestors who weren't bothered by that, took the next step and woke up one morning either dead or all alone. So the system makes perfect sense that it really hurts. The downside, of course, meaning is that you can be lonely in a crowd. If you live somewhere where you don't feel connected to others, it's very bad for you. It damages your health. John Cacioppo he's gone now, but he was doing wonderful work on the psychophysiology of loneliness and just how harmful that was all the way down to the cellular level. In fact, Jan Kiko Glaser still does some really, not loneliness per se, but failing to get along well with your spouse and things like that. Shows that you can get effects all the way down to the cellular level. It dampens the immune system when you are not simpatico with somebody else.
Yeah, there are some of these studies that I cite in one of my classes where they would, inject some kind of rhinovirus. I forget where they did these studies, right? They would give the rhinovirus to these folks, and they would ask them, how many friends they had, and, how many times they were hugged and stuff like this. And almost all of them would predict, right, a more, more symptoms and sort of, worse outcome for this very, very minor intervention.
Yeah, these old Sheldon Cohen studies where they would give you somebody's diseases, or they would even puncture. I think there's some puncture the roof of your mouth, which sounds pretty hideous. And then they look at wound healing.
Well, there's
time.
The one with the blisters. Was
the
blister study
box on your arm? Yeah, all of those. They look like unpleasant studies to be in. I'm sure people were well remunerated for doing them, and they all tell us the same story. Stress is bad, but probably even worse is social disconnection.
And this was the work with the immune system as a bank. I thought this was fascinating research.
Yeah, so Trivers he's the one who was telling me about this in the beginning. And I remember I couldn't even follow it. I'm like, what on earth is he talking about? But I just thought, well, I'll let him talk until I can eventually make heads or tails out of this. But his notion is that, if you think about it, it makes perfect sense that there's a lot of things that our body has to do every day. The brain is probably the best example. At every second of every day, it has to keep the brain powered. And that's 20% of your metabolic energy at all times. So this big brain that we humans have is an expensive proposition, and we have to pay for it constantly. But our immune system makes about a fistful of cells every week, and they're fancy cells. They're not crappy little skin cells that can flake off and get replaced pretty easily. And so your body already has a zillion of them running through it. Some of them are ready for new threats. Some of them are primed to take on old threats. And so it doesn't have to make new immune cells every second of every day. And what that means is that when other things are more demanding, you could dampen your immune productivity, put that on hold for the moment, and deal with the current problem. And stress is one of the factors that tells you you've got other fish to fry. And so stress tends to dampen your immune system. Now, for our ancestors, that made perfect sense, because what stressed them was that saber-toothed tiger running behind them at full speed. But for us, it's a mismatch again, because now we're stressed about our boss who yells at us every day when we go into the office, and we can't escape that because we've got to go there to work. And so that dampening of the immune system, which made perfect sense then, just like inflammation for short-term problems, becomes a big issue when you face chronic problems.
And, the other thing we're seeing is, shrinking family size, right? So we have kind of shrinking. It seems like we have, if we had shrinking sort of friendship networks and they were compensated with sort of, larger family size, then maybe we could get into a debate about how, these trade-offs operated. But it seems like, all of it is shrinking, right?
Yeah, it is. It's a funny thing too, because first of all, we have less contact with our distant family, like you mentioned earlier with our cousin Joe. But second of all, the actual number of kids that we have is going down a lot too. And so if you look in the United States, for example, back in the 60s when I was born, the average family size was almost 4. Now, the average family size is closer to 2. And interestingly, if you looked at how many hours a day parents spent on their kids, it was like 90 minutes then, it's like 120 minutes now, or even a bit more. And so parents are spending more time on fewer kids. And so the experience of just what family life means is also changing a lot. We were sort of raised feral, run amok with our friends, and then reconnect with your family at dinner time. And it doesn't work that way anymore. Kids' lives are much more scheduled. Parents are much more directly involved.
Is there any evidence that, loneliness has a differential impact on you depending on your age, right? So, I mean, presumably young males, they go do their thing. But I mean, as a kid, growing up without friends, I mean, it seems like when you're the most vulnerable, that's when this is most harmful. So maybe when you're like old, you're weak. When you're, pregnant, you're weak. And, when you're a kid, you're weak. I mean, are we able to live without connectedness in certain moments of our life, but not others?
That's a great question. I do think that developmentally, it's very bad for you to be lonely when your brain is coming online, and it's like neglect in early life. It disrupts your HPA axis. It disrupts your ability to express and feel emotions in the way that you're meant to. And I suspect, but don't know, that loneliness has similar effects. I have to admit, I don't know that literature, but I bet you're right about it. I do know that in the case of older adults, our intuition is that what they really want to do is live near family. And often that's their own intuition as well. But what the data show us is that, yeah, family's great. That's not a negative. But in fact, the positive is having peers who are friendly to you, who you enjoy their company and who you see regularly late
like
in
living
life.
in a retirement home kind of thing?
Yeah, retirement home's a great example. And so that's what staves off loneliness in older adults much more than family does, because they all share the same interests and they all have the same kinds of problems. And, your kids don't want to hear about your sciatica yet one more time, but maybe your old friend who suffers from the same problem does want to discuss it again. And so having peers whose company you enjoy is very important in late life, because remember, that's a time where you're starting to become more frail, where your immune system is weaker, and where pathogens can exploit you more easily. And so loneliness matters more then for your health than it does when you're, as you said, a young male is a good example. You're this autonomy machine. You're trying to make it in the world. So you're working hard, either studying or creating something or whatever it is that you do. And that disconnects you from the world. But in your mind, this is all part of the project. It's all part of the plan. And so I think that they might feel a little lonely on occasion when they're doing that, but more they just feel engaged and at it.
Yeah, I did a podcast about parenthood where, the author was saying that when people are contemplating having children, they're only focused on them when they're only focused on anticipating them as children. And they don't actually factor in that, when they're adults, right? As adult children, that's a big part of having a child, is having this adult child that you have for, community and support and connection.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, when you live in rural environments, you typically have lots of kids because A, they're helpful around the farm or whatever it is that you do, and B, you've got infinite space for them. But as we move into urban environments, and the world's becoming far more urban than it used to be. And when I was born, it was about 1 in 3 people lived in a city. By 2007, it was 50-50. And soon it's going to be 1 in 3 live in the country in about 20 years. And so the world's becoming an urban place. And urban environments are not good for large families. They're expensive and difficult, right?
Well, it seems like urban environments are also not good for friendship. I mean, one would think that, when you live in a big city, you would have more opportunity for connection, but the data seems to suggest that you have less connection. I mean, is there a confounding variable? Is it because you're working more?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the thing about cities is that you're cheek by jowl with a gazillion people. Like if you live in an apartment building, there's hundreds of friends for you right there. But ironically, we rarely even know those people. And if you live in the country, you've got nobody's, maybe the nearest neighbor is a quarter mile away. But also, perhaps ironically, we know that person well. And so if you look at representative samples of Americans and you ask them, do you know somebody you trust with your house keys? The answer is more likely to be yes in a rural environment than it is in a city. And it's a little difficult to know why that is. But the thing is that even if they're in my building, unless they're on my floor, I'm hardly ever going to actually encounter them much. And so I might have niceties with them in the elevator, but I don't necessarily even know their name. On the other hand, if they live a quarter mile down the road and we're our closest neighbors, I'm going to see that person a fair bit. And if something goes wrong, I'm going to kind of need that person's help to count on them to house sit my dog or whatever I need. I can't just outsource everything like I can in the city. And so there's an interdependence in the country that just doesn't exist in the city, where you've got strangers who may or may not even encounter each other again, even if they live nearby.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about the frequency of interaction. I remember when I was living in Charlottesville, every time I'd fly into the airport, I knew half the people on the plane, or, anytime you go to the concerts, you knew half the people at intermission, and, you come to a big city and, you don't really know anybody.
Yeah, that all disappears. And so the thing is that when you're going to see people again, you behave very differently from when you don't necessarily expect to see them again. And so we lead these lives where the cities provide us with anonymity, whether we want it or not. Now, they didn't used to. Remember, this links back to residential mobility. And so when Americans are moving all around, you're disrupting neighborhoods all the time. But cities used to have big families that all lived in the same areas and had for long periods of time. And at that period of time, cities didn't have the anonymity. They did once you crossed into somebody else's neighborhood. But in your own neighborhood, you knew everyone much like you would in the country. It's just those days are mostly gone.
Now, you also talk about differences between East and West, right? And so in the East, the culture is one that encourages more connectivity. And I think, there's sort of a material economic explanation for this. I mean, I've heard stories about rice farming versus wheat farming and stuff like that.
Are correct. The rice and wheat is a good predictor, but you can step back from it a little bit more and say, how well-to-do is the society? And when people are poor and scratching out a living, collectivism is the only way to make it work. You need to count on each other. You need to be tightly connected when your roles and responsibilities are super important. And as you get wealthy, what your neighbor's doing starts to become less and less of your concern, because you can keep your own boat afloat. And so as the world has gotten wealthier, by and large, it has moved toward individualism. Now, individualism can vary what it actually means. And so if you look at hunter-gatherers who are nomadic, they have some forms of life that look like individualism. They can just get up and leave and say goodbye. You guys are going north. I'm going to go south and hang with those guys. That was allowed, and you can't do that in a horticultural or agricultural society. You've put too much investment into the land, nobody's going anywhere. And so the rules of exactly what collectivism mean differ as a function of the way you make a living. But your general point is right on target, that forms of farming that demanded cooperation led to a greater collectivism. Wealth or lack of wealth, poverty led to collectivism because you needed each other more. And all those things, by and large, are disappearing over the world. And so we're seeing people moving toward individualism everywhere we look. Well, almost everywhere we look. There's pockets of the world that aren't shifting.
Now, as we see this movement towards more individualism, it seems like what makes us happy is not moving as quickly, right? Because part of what makes us happy, obviously, is cultural, and we can presumably manipulate that at speed and scale. But the other part that is more deeply rooted, that part is, maybe it'll shift in a couple thousand generations, but it's not going to change overnight.
Yeah. And so what we need to do instead is try to find ways to live a modern world, because we're not going to undo that. Well, not without terrible luck. Live in a modern world, but do so in a way that finds a different blend, the kind of blend that our ancestors would have had, where we have those same kinds of connections that we interact with regularly. And you gave a good example earlier where you can use the internet to do that. You and I are talking right now from thousands of miles apart. It's way better.
It would be better if we're drinking some wine together.
Exactly. I think it's way better to be in person for a host of reasons. One of them is just eye contact. When I look at you, I feel like I'm looking you in the eye, but it won't look like that to you because of the interface of the machines, right? And you're now a flat 2D image, and so we don't get the same pupillary dilation. There's lags. All of those things make it work not quite as well. Most of that, I suspect, is technological and can be improved. When a version of you that looks just like you is basically sitting on the other side of the table, maybe it'll be 90% there rather than 30% there.
But it seems like we do have more choice than we think, right? So it'd be easy for us to say, well, I can't build a community because it's difficult or expensive or costly or it's not automatic. I mean, the hunter-gatherers didn't have to work on connectedness. I mean, obviously they had to work on their relationships, but they didn't have to, work to find people to hang out with. Are people just kind of, I don't know, giving up too easily and saying, it's easier for me to pick up the phone and do something else?
They don't realize how important it is the problem. This is that kind of experience sampling thing. And so when COVID hit is when it occurred to me, I was letting, I'd let some connections lapse, and now I'm forced to spend time alone, and I don't want to. And so that was when I started to be conscious. All right, well, who do I want to talk to more? And I tried to find people where I could say, I still want to do the things that I want to do because I don't have a lot of spare time. So in my spare time, there's things I enjoy. I'd like to do those things, but how can I do them with somebody else rather than doing them alone, which a lot of them I was doing alone. Now, in an ideal world, you do them face to face with other people, but doing them on the internet with somebody else over the phone, over any form of social media is a lot better than just doing them by yourself.
Yeah, for me, COVID actually turned out to be pretty good because, all the excuses that people had for not coming over for dinner, were shut down. You can't tell me you're going to the concert. Can't tell me you're, you're going going shopping because, that stuff's all closed down. So it could turn out in some environments to be, be a good thing.
And a good reminder of just that, we're not snow leopards. We don't like to sit in our house alone.
But there's also, you talk about political alignment and how, we have these sort of different, political ideologies that could potentially line up somewhat with different positions on this scale of values. I found this part, interesting. It's not a kind of a nice, neat alignment. It seems like both political positions seem to lean into both aspects of what we are looking for.
Yeah, it's not as straightforward as some other forms of like males being more autonomy and females being more connection. But because there's different forms of connection that people on the political right or people on the political left tend to emphasize. But if you look at people on the right, they tend to be, when the things that they care, everyone cares about connection. But for them, part of what is a little bit more about connection, a little bit more important about it, is connecting to your group. And so things like loyalty and patriotism really resonate with people on the right, and less so with people on the left, who are much more concerned about connection with individuals and individual opportunities to succeed, that they, especially if they see somebody who faces barriers. And so when you look at politics, you can see that people who tend to be focused on autonomy, for whatever reason, are more likely to be on the political right, and people who focused on connection, for whatever reason, are more likely to be on the left. But as you say, they also switch over depending on the kind of connection that you're talking about. That, for me, though, the nice thing, what I discovered and didn't really realize, was that connection seems to win. And so if you look at across the spectrum, for example, and you ask, should we spend more money more of our tax dollars on, or should we pay the same taxes that we pay on social services, or should we pay less? Even though people on the right want to pay less and people on the left want to pay more, when you average it all out, even people on the right are more favorable toward connection than people on the left are favorable toward autonomy. So a connection gets weighted more highly on average all the way across the board. Even among people who want their taxes reduced and don't want to pay as much for social services, they're still more supportive of them than people on the left are of doing the opposite strategy.
Are there any policies that could potentially, I don't know, make it easier for people to find connection? I mean, because at some point this is a public health issue, right? Even if you don't care about, I don't know, happiness as a policymaker, you're perhaps interested in health, right? So we always use health as the excuse for doing things. I mean, are there policy measures that could improve connectivity?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been focused on what individuals can do for themselves, but you can ask yourself, well, what can my country do that would facilitate connection? I have to admit, nothing occurs to me immediately. It's a great question, though, and it's the kind of question that you'd love to see policymakers engage with. We think about things like helping families by making daycare more accessible, putting it in your building, things like that. But you can ask that question more broadly. Well, what can I do to make it easier for people to connect? And well, I do know, I worked with this workplace here in town. It was a bunch of young people doing cryptocurrency, cutting edge engineering solutions and things. And they've got a bunch of people who, can barely do their own laundry and make their own food, but are these geniuses at what they do. And they had the good sense to make them dinner every night. And so they've got this great chef, and he just cooks food. And most of them, they stay and eat most of the time, even though it's not required. And when they're staying and eating, when you go there and listen to the conversations, they're still talking about work and how to solve that problem. So it's like a great investment on the part of the company, right? Well, you could imagine trying to do that writ large.
Yeah, so companies like Google, of course, have these cafeterias, right, that encourage people to hang out, and all they need to do is build some dormitories.
Yeah, get them to live there,
and they can get them to stick around, 24/7, right? But I mean, even universities. I know some universities have encouraged, home ownership close to campus, and here at Berkeley, most professors can't afford to live close to campus. And so they live, sometimes half hour, 45 minutes away. And so that kind of seems to undermine a sense of community.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And so there's when online started to become a big thing and you could take online classes, there was a big push at lots of universities to, boy, this is going to be really great. We can reach out to lots more people. They're going to really learn a lot. But actually, a lot of the fun of university and even a lot of the learning of university is not sitting there looking at a screen and listening to a lecture, but the engagement with each other, the back and forth. And so fortunately, most of them quickly realized that this was not a good way to go. And furthermore, the bottom line told them it wasn't a good way to go because alumni who spent more time online were less generous to the university. The experience wasn't as good for them.
Yeah, and when people talk about football games, why should we be spending money on the football team? Right? I don't know. Do they have that in Australia? Do they have
we have rugby, and we don't spend much money on it.
Yeah, but I always thought academics are very skeptical. Like, why are they doing this? But it, of course, provides it's a community building exercise, right?
Yeah. And I remember when I was at Ohio State University and at University of Michigan, where I got my PhD, you'd have a guy who never went to that university, and they'd have the big flag on their yard with that because they love the team. They're a big fan of the Ohio State football team. They didn't go there, but they still love the university. And that's such a different experience from somebody. If they don't have a team, they're not spending that money. Why would somebody in town want to spend their tax dollars on that university if they didn't go there themselves?
Yeah, I mean, sports seems to be one of those areas that brings people together. I'm from Philadelphia, and they just won the Super Bowl, and you would see these people, complete strangers, on the street, like hugging each other and so forth. Right? I mean, presumably when they lose, it doesn't have the same result, right? But also, I mean, at my university, there was a big fight over when I first came to Berkeley. There was. They had a faculty lounge and they had no coffee machine in there. And we had to work hard to put a coffee coffee machine. A simple thing like a coffee machine, however, can really jumpstart a community.
Yeah, and that's a big mistake to not have just done it automatically. And I remember, I've seen those kinds of things before. And I remember when I was head of our department, we had to take the admin staff and remove them from individual offices and put them in a joint space because we simply were too squeezed. We'd grown too much. And I said, what can I do? I know you guys, this is not a great thing. What can I do to make it up for you? And somebody says, good coffee machine. I was like, done. That's the perfect request because it's a chance for people to get together and chat, have a cup of coffee, re-energize and reconnect with each other and then happily get back to work.
So what can we do as individuals? I mean, I was just talking to a friend who, said that, she found it very difficult to take a phone away from her kid because every other parent let their kids have phones and, they said, well, I can't let my kid run out in the street and play because there's nobody to play with. So it does seem like it's a collective action problem, right? I mean, how can we solve that? I mean, can we brand our neighborhoods and say, this is a neighborhood where kids can play. This is a neighborhood where, you have to come to the barbecue for Memorial Day. I mean, how can we do this? It's hard as individuals, right?
Yeah, there's two answers. One, the kid answer, you hit the nail on the head. That with kids, you can't have the only kid who doesn't have a phone or an Instagram account or whatever. But what you can do, and in fact, what's happening across the U.S. is that you can have parental consent laws about whether kids are allowed to even set up their things. You can have schools that take phones away, and you're allowed to have a phone in school. And that way, you're not the only one who doesn't have it. Nobody does. Because with kids, it's super important. You want them to be playing face-to-face and not just isolated, doing the sort of parasocial activities that aren't really socializing with each other. And you have some control over that, but you have to have joint control. And so as a neighborhood, it's awesome if you would agree, all right, it may be too much to ask to say no phones, but we could say no phones between school getting out and 5:30 p.m. because that way, good time of day, safe, et cetera, kids can run around and play. Now they can go home, have dinner, do their homework, whatever. So things like that would be great if you could get community level agreement on them. And it's starting to happen. I'm here in Australia. Starting in December of this year, it's going to be illegal for minors to have social media accounts. And so you can still have a phone, but a ton of what was so attractive about that phone will be taken away. And with little luck, it'll get people running around and playing more, children. As adults, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, well, it could make things worse if that drives them to like non-social media consumption, right? So if they just sort of say, okay, well, I'm just going to go look at porn, right? Or something like that. Like, then they don't go out and play. They just kind of get even more like antisocial.
It's very possible that the solution will be worse than the problem. You don't know until you try it. And then, of course, it's a moving target. You'll need to fix that. But these fixes have promise because it's not good for you to be spending your childhood on a phone instead of in person. It's not good for you to be doing it in your adulthood either. I used to walk by construction sites all the time where people are all laughing on their break, eating sandwiches, having a good time. And now when I walk by them, they're still eating their sandwiches, but every one of them is on their phone individually, and they're not having fun with each other anymore. I just have to believe the job isn't as fun as it used to be. Now, with that said, though, as adults, we're stuck with this stuff. It exists. We can't make it go away for ourselves. And so then the question just becomes, well, how can I change my habits in a way that leverage the good of social media, good of e-contact, but also force myself to have more non-e-contact? And in my mind, that you're never going to go back to a world where there wasn't so many forms of entertainment where people were sufficiently bored that they would go to the Lions Club every Thursday night and put on a funny hat and do their thing. That's just not happening anymore. And so what you want is to try to say, all right, well, how can I get people to do what they really want to do of all the millions of activities that exist, but do it in a more social way? And from my perspective, that's the solution.
Yeah. And what about sort of adults? Because, I know a lot of people say that, making friendships when they're older is a lot harder, right? When you're in college, at least it used to be the case. You're kind of thrust together with a bunch of people in the dormitory, and there are other environments, sports teams and so forth. But once you get into the working world, it's a lot harder, and even at work, it's harder. People kind of frown on you discussing personal matters at work now. I mean, I don't even know which of my colleagues are married or not, even ones that I've been, working with for years, because it kind of talking about that stuff is seen as inappropriate in a work context. So how do people who are, adults, go about creating community, particularly when they plop down into a new environment?
Yeah, it's hard, and the problem is there's no one set answer. But in my mind, the answer that's the most likely to stick is where you say, all right, what are the activities that I really enjoy, but that I do alone? Now, how can I do those in a community context? And sometimes it can be trivially community, but it still matters. And so, for example, if I let's say that when I write, I need to be alone, but if I'm reading or grading, I can be in a public setting and I'm perfectly effective. Well, if there's parts of your job that are that way that you would normally do alone, but you can do in a more crowded setting, go to a park or a cafe and go at the same time every day, because at least you're getting some social interaction with the random people you see. But especially if you go at the same time every day or every week, whenever your schedule is, you'll see the same folks who are doing the same thing, and they actually kind of become your friends. And so even if they're not
as long as you're not wearing headphones.
Yeah, if they're not all wearing headphones. Even if they're not your closest buddy on earth, those kinds of little social interactions where you get to know the barista and she says hello to you and she knows your order, those kinds of things matter a lot, because we feel that sense of connection, we feel that sense of community. Now, beyond that, though, what you would be ideal is, what are the leisure activities that you do that you really enjoy, and are you doing with somebody else? Well, great, you're good to go. But if you're doing them alone, join a running club, join a painting group, join a whatever the case might be. And if you're introverted and that's too aversive to you, you try to find one other person who wants to do those kinds of things. It doesn't have to be a group. So it always has to be tailored to what you want to do. And then, of course, I'm a big believer in seeing if it helped. If a month later you go, God, I hate my running club, well, stop going, try something else, right? But the goal is, what I've come to believe is, anything that you enjoy doing, unless you want to be alone while you're doing it, and some things we do, you should try to do with others, and you should try to do it in a habitual way so you don't have to decide. When we wake up in the morning, we don't decide if we're going to brush our teeth. We just habitually do it, let's say, after breakfast. If you have to decide every day, should I do X, the answer is often going to be no. But if you surrender control of that decision to the environment, oh, it's Thursday at 5, I'm going to go with my running club. Oh, it's Monday at 2, I got to get down to the art studio where I'll be working on my painting. Even if I'm just working side by side, things will slowly develop that way.
Now, because people don't always know, right, what makes them happy, it seems like this is something that we kind of need to be taught, right? A little bit. I mean, it's not entirely instinctual. And so where should we be taught this? Because our parents might not know what it is that's going to make us happy. But there is science here, right? There is some knowledge that we can get. Where should it be? I mean, I remember teaching a course on decision theory, and I would kind of smuggle in some stuff on subjective well-being. I teach a course on, behavioral finance, and I smuggle in some stuff on, subjective well-being. And there are now in business schools and, some courses on happiness, right? Should we have kind of courses on, well-being and happiness baked into our curriculum, or should this just be something that is in the psychology departments for those folks who are super interested?
Look, I'd love to see it baked in everywhere so we all have a little bit better understanding of it. There's lots of good literature, and it'd be wonderful if that were widely disseminated. And I know a lot of the happiness colleagues of mine are trying hard to do that, sometimes with limited success, sometimes very successfully. But I do think that there's so much that's bespoke that I'm a big believer in these apps, in self-discovery in this kind of way, because that's what prevents us from knowing, is that our lived experiences don't perfectly resonate with our retrospective self. And when we look back on them, we can miss the bus and not notice what really mattered, and fail to notice and think something mattered that didn't. And so I've got this nephew, the super genius programming computer guy, and I happened to mention Kahneman's work to him, and he went out. I don't remember if he wrote an app or he got one, because he's perfect. He can write anything. And he was like, I realized that the person I was dating wasn't making me happy. The job, he had this long list of things that he discovered about himself, and he's so much happier now, having taken his own advice, so to speak, on board by looking at those activities that when he did them, he enjoyed it, and maximizing those, and looking at those activities that when he did them, he wasn't giving them very high scores, and just cutting them out of his life where possible. And so I do think you're right that better knowledge of the happiness literature would be a great thing. But it's also so easy now to download something on your phone and just experiment on yourself. And if you're happy, well, great. You don't even need to bother. But if you're thinking, boy, my life's not going the way I want to, a buck later, you're good to go.
Right. So self-knowledge and learning how to live basically are the same questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Bill, thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. This book, the new book, is called The Social Paradox. And believe me, there is so much in these books that we didn't even touch on. So we're well worth the read. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Greg. It's great chatting with you.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.